Hello, and welcome back to webinar number 4 in the social impact training, and it's Heidi here again. And today the focus is all around the ways in which you can collect your data in order to measure the impact that your organisation is having. So as you'll see, what we've already covered is an overview of what social impact measurement is. The second webinar, we look at deciding what you want to measure and the scope of your social impact report for your first report. The third one, we were looking at your stakeholders and also starting to think about the data that you need to collect. But we've also, within that, looked at what your mission, values and objectives are for your organisation, which then gives you real clarity about what kind of information you need to start collecting in order to measure your performance against those objectives and those values. So today we're going to think about what ways you can actually collect the data. Now, this is usually the bit where people get unstuck in terms of their social impact reporting, purely because they are fine in terms of identifying what activities and objectives they have as an organisation, but when it comes to then saying, well, how will we actually collect that data, they often get into problems because they are, well, we've already got all of this reams and reams of data that we're collecting already. How on earth are we going to get people to give us more information and data which is now the right kind of data? Because often the data that you're already collecting is all about your outputs. So the numbers of people that you're working with, the number of training sessions you deliver, the number of people that say they're healthier, or whatever it is. So very basic information, or perhaps it's even information about how much they like your service, how much they like your staff. So it's actually more around the quality of the customer service as opposed to the types of outcomes that you achieve for those particular people. So what we're going to cover today in a bit more detail, we did start to look at this at the end of the last session, a very brief overview, but we're really going to go into more detail and look at how you can actually consult the different stakeholders that you need to consult for the areas that you're including within your social impact report. So as I said last week, it's critical, if at all possible, to use as many existing sources of information and data as you've got, providing their appropriate types of data. Because if they're just about numbers or people ticking boxes, yes or no's, then it's not going to tell you about the real difference or the changes and the impact that you're having on those people's lives or those organisations. So you'll need to add some additional information into your questionnaires in order to find out what difference you actually make as an organisation. And the way that I recommend that people do this, if they've not previously collected this type of data, is to consult with a few members from each of the different stakeholder groups. So if you're going to talk to your clients for a particular project, perhaps some partners that you work with on that same project, and potentially also your staff, you would consult with them and find out what kind of outcomes and impact and difference that they feel that service has on them. And then once you've got a bit more detail, create some questions to get a wider response from that particular stakeholder group. So start with a kind of a mini survey with a few people to give you some idea of what kinds of outcomes you can expect people to say, and then you can go to a box list type survey or questionnaire potentially for the next stage. So you might want to ask questions like, you know, what difference has this service made to your life? What's the biggest change in your health? What's the biggest change in how you spend your time since you received support from us? Or, you know, have there been any differences in your life since you accessed this service or this support, whatever it is? And that way you're asking quite open-ended questions, and people can give you a range of responses. And then potentially you could then say, once you do the more wider surveying of all of that stakeholder group, or more of that stakeholder group, you could have a list of potential outcomes for them to tick if any of these changes have happened in their life. And that way you're not automatically preempting the kind of outcomes that you're assuming for that stakeholder group. If you didn't do that initial smaller survey with the stakeholder groups to start with, you could potentially miss some of the outcomes. And obviously also within your questions, when you do go out to your wider stakeholder group, is to make sure you include an option for other, where they can enter their responses to what the outcome is that you've achieved for them, because otherwise you may miss some crucial outcomes that have been achieved. One of the biggest things that I've found with organisations is that they assume the types of outcomes that they're achieving for their stakeholder group, which aren't necessarily the things that are important to those different stakeholder groups. So it's vitally important that you do consult with them to make sure you're measuring the right outcomes going forward. The other way that a lot of people use to collect data, particularly if they want to report quite quickly on their social impact, or they need it if they're going for a tender or a contract, is to use a focus group. Now this works best if you've got kind of a member group or regular weekly or monthly meetings with one of your stakeholder groups, so that you can then consult with them en masse, ask them the questions and get the information from them as a group, in order that you can then report on the outcomes that you've achieved for them. So focus groups are a great way to get the data quickly, and it's also a great way to get more in-depth information, more of the qualitative information, and to start building information for case studies potentially, which is the next way in which you can collect data. As I said, when we first started the social impact webinars, one of the things I like is this blend of information between a case study and also the social return on investment, the financial information incorporated within that case study, so people can see not just the social impact you have, but also the economic impact that you have on an individual in their life, and how that then can be widened out to what you do as an organisation for all the people that you work with. So case studies are a great way to showcase different areas of your work. What I found though is often there'll be case studies that are quite similar that organisations want to use. So again, the best thing to do if you're collecting case studies is to showcase the different types of services, or the different types of people, or the different types of organisations that you work with, and the different kinds of support you provide, so that you can really show all of the different areas of your work within those case studies. And some of the work I've done with one organisation was purely developing case studies where it incorporated some of the financial potential savings to statutory agencies, because they were going for a tender and needed to evidence what they could potentially save statutory agencies if they bought into their services. So again, they're a way to adapt how you then report on your social impact and what you present to those different organisations. The other thing that's crucially important with your data collection is this baseline information. So if you don't collect any information when you start working with a person or an organisation, then it's going to be very, very difficult to evidence that any changes that have happened are a consequence of them working with you. So it's really, really important to get that initial information. So if you said, well, they're volunteering more, they're accessing training now, they're in employment, they've got better family relationships, their health has improved, the organisation has grown, whatever it is that you're saying is the outcome that you've achieved, then you need to have some information from when you first started working with them, and some information at a second point or a third point later on in time that can evidence that things have actually improved for that particular person. So it's really important to collect that initial information. The other thing that's usually included in a social impact report is some information from partner organisations. Now, you may not include this if you've not identified them as one of the key stakeholders that you want to consult in this first social impact reporting period. So you may decide that actually you don't want to include partner organisations and get a lot of information from them. But if you are going to include them, then it's quite important to ask them, what do they see as the benefits of working in partnership with you? What are the key outcomes or differences that being in partnership with your organisation has achieved for them, so that you can then use that in your social impact report. And the final area, as I've mentioned, is this financial data, which I like to blend in with the social and the case studies, and also your environmental data if you're going to include that. Now, depending on what you decided the scope of your social impact report was, you may actually be saying, we're only reporting on 1 or 2 specific projects that we deliver as an organisation, and therefore we're not going to include a lot of financial data or environmental data, because that's at a wider organisational level and you are only looking at specific projects. But the financial data is brilliant, particularly if you're going for grant funding, tenders, commissions, etc., because it can evidence what your interventions can potentially save statutory agencies going forward. And it also proves that it's worthwhile them giving you money or investing in your organisation, because you can save more money in the future for them. Now, most people get scared of anything with numbers, but to be perfectly honest, there's quite a lot of spreadsheets and data out there already that provide you with this financial data that you can implement and use quite quickly. So New Economics Foundation, they produced a spreadsheet which had some financial proxies, so the values for particular outcomes included in it. You've also got your NHS Unit Costs, which is a spreadsheet which gives you a value for every service operation, etc., that the NHS provides, which can be used to value things. So quite a lot of the organisations I work with, because they do health interventions, will be able to use the NHS unit costs to say, well, because of our intervention, this person didn't need to go to hospital, they didn't need to visit their GP so often, they no longer needed a health visitor, they didn't go to daycare, whatever it is, and use the values of those to evidence that their service is worth investing in. The other thing around environmental impact, obviously, in terms of the typical data that people collect around this, it's usually around how much they're recycling and how you're trying to minimise the amount of waste that you have. Also around the amount of energy that you're using, so electrics, gas, and the amount of CO2 emissions that you have, and hopefully you can evidence that you're reducing the CO2 emissions you have year on year, if that is something that you have quite a lot of control over. And you can also report on the amount of CO2 emissions that come from staff travel and commuting, etc., and how you potentially try to minimise that by having online meetings and reducing the amount of time staff spend out of the office or coordinating meetings, etc. So they only make that one journey and get all of their meetings done externally rather than having a meeting every other day. So they're the main things around the environment. And then obviously if you are an environmental organisation, then you'll have a much wider detail and scope in terms of what you actually produce and evidence around the environmental impact. There may also be something where you're using renewable energies, you may be recycling and selling things through shops, etc. And you could look at the amount of tons of materials or items that you've prevented from going to landfill. So there's all kinds of things that you could look at around your environmental impact, but it's predominantly driven by what you're doing as an organisation and what's important in terms of your mission and your objectives, and also what you've defined as the scope for this first year's reporting. So I don't really want to say much more in terms of the data collection. I've got some examples of typical questions that I will be sending out to people, so they can have a look at the kinds of questions that get asked when you're collecting data. But really it's driven by what you've decided that you want to report on. And also the other thing you may include is around your values and how effective you are at achieving the values you have as an organisation, and whether people are aware of them. So there's all kinds of stuff that you could potentially include. But really it's a case of looking at what you've already got and what you then need to start collecting, as we talked about last week, but going in a little bit more depth to thinking about what the actual questions are that you need to be asking now. If you do have any questions, these are my contact details. Please feel free to give me a call. Thank you.